Okay, so I'm going to talk about students applying to university and the fact that they apply to university with predicted rather than achieved A-level grades. And my focus is on the differential between those predicted and achieved grades, namely that they are very optimistic. I'm interested in how this optimism varies potentially by student sociodemographic characteristics and by school characteristics. And if we find that optimism, to try and think about why those patterns might exist, what might they be reflecting? So it's a very exploratory and descriptive analysis that we show here, and I'm sure kind of other talks will kind of come back to some of the themes that we'll touch on. So in England, students apply to university via UCAS, universities, colleges, admission systems with predicted grades rather than achieved grades, and this is because they apply some 6 months prior to taking their A-level exams, let alone receiving their achieved grades. And so these predicted grades are clearly all important, both in terms of which courses students actually choose to apply to, and also whether those courses make offers back to those students and whether those students accept those offers, and so on. And that might also include the nature of those offers, where there are particular requirements attached to them. So I am an outsider to higher education research. This is the only higher education research I've done. So I've learned quite a lot of things along the way about this, which surprised me. And it might not surprise you in the room, who are all higher education researchers more formally than me, but they will surprise the general public, I think. Now, the first of these was that I kind of knew that teachers will predict optimistically for their students. Okay, what I didn't know was that UCAS actively encourage teachers to predict optimistically. I had naively assumed that ideally these teachers will be making unbiased predictions, not positively biased predictions. Surely that would be more useful to have accuracy. But there is a good argument for positive predicted grades, which is that they motivate students, okay? It boosts their confidence, but also it encourages students to apply to at least some of their courses to be more aspirational, so that if everything does come off in their actual exams and they get great grades, they have a great course to go on to. So actually that all makes some sense. However, at the same time, UCAS also realise and warn explicitly against teachers predicting excessively optimistically. And why is this? Well, clearly, if a student is predicted very highly, well, they're just not going to get the grade. So even if they are given an offer off the back of that, they're going to struggle to get the grade to get in. So that's not really helping anyone. Or if they did get in, perhaps because the course, and this does happen a lot, lets in students even when they miss the entry requirements, when they've been made an offer, then the students might actually struggle when they're actually on those courses. So it can be counterproductive. So this was all kind of quite interesting. And then I was even more interested when I discovered that UCAS, despite giving a strong steer in favour of optimism, yet against excessive optimism, simultaneously gave no numerical guidance whatsoever as to what they meant by a desirable and an undesirable amount of optimism. So what should teachers be doing? Should they be over-predicting students by half a grade, 3/4 of a grade, 1 grade? At what point does this become bad? What's optimal? So none of that numerical guidance is there. And so that led me to think, well, in this kind of situation where there's this kind of strong kind of steer, but no kind of regulation or guidance, that feels like exactly the kind of situation where sociodemographic differences may arise, where with some social groups being benefiting by this and other groups being disadvantaged by this. And then, of course, that in itself is straight away a worry, but it might be an especial worry were it the case that groups who are historically underrepresented at universities and are disadvantaged were the ones to be losing out? Okay. So this led me into looking at this research. So what about previous research? Okay, I'm not the first to do this, and indeed Jill Wyness is in the room, who's written a very nice earlier paper on this topic. Ofqual did a literature review in 2020, and they did this literature review actually in response to them having to come up with the CAGs in 2020 when exams were cancelled altogether, and they were looking for literature which had looked at sociodemographic biases and teacher predictions, and one of the very natural ones to look at was for A-level grades. Now, this literature, you might say, fortunately, concludes that optimism is actually higher for those groups who have traditionally been disadvantaged in academia and getting into university. So Black students, Asian students, lower socioeconomic student groups. Okay, so that's where optimism is higher. They say that there are mixed effects of age and gender. Now that's interesting because I'm going to show you some quite interesting gender effects. So that will differ from the literature to date. They also say that some effects of A-level subject and school type, but those are small. Well, I'd say that actually there's some really kind of quite strong patterns for A-level subjects and school type. So again, that's differing from the literature. Then there's other factors, again, the geography of all of this, which there hasn't really been a literature base to date, which shows interesting results. But one thing which is really important is that the literature points to an A-level scale ceiling effect. And this kind of makes all the analysis quite tricky. Essentially, the problem is that the higher achieving students are, the less you can over-predict. And taken at the extreme, if a teacher has a student in front of them, Matt over here is a clear A-star student, what can we predict them? Well, you can't predict A double star, you can predict A star, so we can't predict Matt optimistically at all. But clearly that plays out across students' sociodemographic groups. Some groups are higher achieving than others, and then there's less headspace to over-predict. So when we see a differential in optimism, what does it mean? To what extent is it just this mechanical explanation, or to what extent might other things be going on? It says other things which are of more interest, more concern perhaps, than the scaling artifact. So the data that we look at for this exploratory analysis is grade data, which is a merge of Ofqual, DFE, and UCAS data that was put together once again to look at CAGs, actually, to allow researchers to independently check what was done for the 2020 cohort. Now I'm actually going to look at the 2019 cohort, 1 year before COVID, because my interest is different. It's what happens in a normal year with A-level predicted grades. It's a big old data set. All the A-level qualifications are in there. Okay, so the first thing I did, of course, was to establish, well, how much optimism is there in general? Okay, so this was the next thing which surprised me, because the degree of optimism is high. I was expecting just a bit of optimism, but to me it sounds pretty great. So one way to express this is by looking at a histogram of predicted grades versus achieved grades, left and right. In terms of predicted grades, we've got over 50% of A-level qualifications are predicted to be A or higher, A or A star. But in reality, in terms of the achieved grades, less than 30% are A or higher. So more than 50% in predicted, less than 30% for achieved. But the actual metric that I'm going to use in the subsequent slides is slightly different. Essentially, we're going to say A star is 6, A is 5, B is 4, and so on, which is standard in this literature. And then we can talk about the mean over prediction and number of grades per qualification. And what we find is that across all the data, the average student is being over-predicted by 0.84 of a grade per subject. 0.84, that's big, right? You times that by 3 for 3 A-level subjects, we're talking about basically 2.5, 2.5 grades. So again, Matt is my example throughout this talk. He wasn't actually an A-star student, actually. Forget that entirely, that story. Here's another story. He went on to get 3 Bs in his A-levels. What would he have been predicted some 6 months previously? Well, most likely 2 A's and a B or 3 A's. Okay, so there's this big disconnect between predictions and achieved, much bigger than I naively thought. Then that shifts us on to, well, how does that disconnect, that optimism, vary across student characteristics? Okay, so in one sense, we don't want any variation at all. Surely that seems fairest. But then we think, well, actually, there has to be variation because of that A-level scale ceiling effect. Okay, so how can we kind of look at this in its initial descriptive statistics? Well, I'm plotting the mean predicted grade is the top line plot with the hollow markers. The mean achieved grade is the bottom line plots with the solid markers. We've got 7 student characteristics along the x-axis: gender, 2 measures of ethnicity, 3 measures of socioeconomic status and disability. In each of those characteristics, the individual categories within them are ordered from left to right in increasing order of mean achieved grade. Okay. So what can we see from this? Okay, well, one thing you can see without even getting into the detail yet is that there is a tapering of the 2 lines. There is a convergence as we move from left to right and up the page in general. And that's hinting at the A-level scale ceiling effect. Those lines have to come together once you reach, if you extrapolate it up to A star, they'd have to converge at that point. And so you can see a bit of that going on. So if we look at gender, we see there's no difference in optimism. So it looks very boring. Yeah, males and females. Males are 0.83, females 0.84, same mean achieved grades, same mean predicted grades, who cares? Well, actually, we'll come back later to gender, and there is something interesting going on behind the scenes. But if we look at ethnicity, the mean optimism for Black students is 1.07, but it's only 0.77 for white students, so a third of a grade differential. We look at IMD is 1.01 for the most deprived, 0.72 for the least deprived, so again around 0.3. So again around just under a third of a grade per subject. So just under a third of a grade per subject there as well. Now, so does appear to be kind of interesting differences across those characteristics. Now, another thing to pick up here is coming back to the A-level scale ceiling effect kind of issue. Well, another way of seeing that there's more going on than just that simple mechanical explanation is that the top line plot is not a mirror image of the bottom one. You know, for some of these characteristics, some categories, there are notable kinks up and down. We've got kind of confidence intervals on those. So these look to be more than just the kind of standard kind of chance variation. So it looks, for example, in blue, we've got 3 groups here, perhaps, which have got lower mean predicted grades than what you might otherwise expect, given what they went on to achieve. And these are white and black Caribbean, white and black African, and white students in that instance. Okay. So we can do the same kind of thing, having done that for student sociodemographics, for the other set of variables we're interested in, school type or school characteristics. Okay, so the plot's set up in the same way, but now I have the region the school's in, the county that the school's in, the school type, and school gender. And what do we see here? Well, there's regional differences. Mean optimism is highest in London by 0.97, and that's unexpectedly high given what they've gone to achieve, and it's lowest in neighbouring southeast, 0.72. So again, a big region differential. And you might already be thinking ahead, like, well, you already showed that optimism is higher for Black and Asian students, and there's a higher concentration of those in London and the Southeast. And so, yeah, we'll get on to statistical adjustment shortly. At county level, there's massive variation. Yeah, these are smaller entities, of course, and so you're always going to see more variation, but it drops from 1.05 in Staffordshire all the way down to 0.57 in East Sussex. So there's really quite different optimism across different places. And again, we see some kind of interesting kinks. So here, Leicestershire is noticeably lower mean optimism than we might otherwise expect. Whereas we take an orange one here, Rutland, 0.88 is noticeably higher than other counties which ended up having similar mean achieved grades. So there's an interesting geographic element of this as to what's going on. Okay, so let's now try and shift into kind of a bit more of statistically adjusting these mean differentials as a way to try and understand why they might be the way they are. So one thing I keep talking about is the A-level scale ceiling effect. How can we try and adjust for this? Well, one way would be to try and control for the A-level grade itself, but this feels a little bit circular because, of course, A-level grades of themselves are a function of the predicted grade and the degree of optimism. So to control for it would feel a little bit circular, You might call that confounding. You might kind of, I guess, call that heterogeneity from an economics background. So I kind of sidestep that and do something else, which will also be imperfect, but I adjust for GCSE scores. And so just looking at GCSE scores in isolation, you can see as we move from the lowest to the highest GCSE score, the 25 bands here, we have a really big tapering of the predicted and achieved lines. And of course, we're approaching A star here. There's very little headroom. So we adjust for GCSE results, and we are perhaps going to make slightly more meaningful comparisons between sociodemographic groups, because we're going to be comparing a little bit more like-for-like students who differ, who are similar educationally, but differ in terms of the focal sociodemographic characteristic being studied. So we'll do that. We'll do that. I don't know what happened there, so apologies. But we'll also adjust for A-level subject. Now, this was something where I think there's some results of A-level subject that are kind of small. Well, here are some of the most interesting results, I would say, and they're pretty big. Here, this looks very different from previous plots in that the top line is very kinked versus the bottom, which means that there are really other explanations going on for mean optimism beyond varying across subjects beyond simply the kind of the general kind of trend of tapering together of these two lines. So we go into the middle and look at physics. Okay, we'll start with physics. Imagine applying to do a physics undergraduate. Okay, well, first of all, where are physics undergraduate courses? Well, they're disproportionately in Russell Group universities, which have high entry requirements in general. Okay, so already, you're going to have to predict high because the entry requirements are high. Not only that, if you want to do a physics undergraduate, you have to have done physics A-level. And so the courses will be saying not only do you need to get high grades in general, you need to get a specific high grade, let's say an A, in physics A-level. Okay, so that's a lot of inflationary pressure on teachers. You contrast that with, let's take the one next door, sociology, where students end up getting the same mean achieved grades, okay, for the country as a whole. Well, if you want to do sociology at university, well, that's a little bit less concentrated in Russell Group universities. Entry requirements are a bit lower in general, but most importantly, you don't have to, the entry requirements will not require you to study sociology at A-level in order to do it at degree level. So they won't be saying you need to get a specific grade in sociology. There's less pressure. Now, this is all very important because our interest is not A-level subjects so much as in comparing student groups and school groups, but different student groups leaning towards different subjects. And so that's why we want to adjust for this. Now, I said physics had high optimism, and you can see the same plays out for chemistry and biology, probably for similar reasons. But if we shunt over to, say, performing expressive arts and art and design subjects, we have much lower optimism than we might otherwise expect. Now, here, I think, a most likely explanation here is that these are some of the few A-level subjects which have coursework components. And so actually, several of those components of those subjects will already be banked at the point of making predictions. You can only over-predict on the remaining components, which aren't many. And so for the qualification as a whole, that's really going to limit the degree of optimism. So I suspect that might be playing out for those subjects. Okay, let's now get into some of the statistical adjustment. Let's get back to gender. And remember, I said gender didn't look very interesting. Look very boring, be easy to jump over that. But actually, we're going to see some interesting results of statistical adjustment. So this is the new plot. We're now plotting mean optimism for the two categories of interest, which here are females and males. We're plotting it against, on the x-axis, the model, which the mean difference has come from. So the first model, model 1, makes no statistical adjustments for any control variables. So simply replicates what we've already seen, which is that females are predicted 0.84, males optimism, and males is 0.83 for optimism, mean optimism. But then we adjust for more and more variables as we move along. So you adjust for GCSE scores, and because girls score higher at GCSE than boys, and higher GCSEs are associated with lower optimism in general, you equate girls and boys and say, well, what if they have the same GCSE results? Well, let's compare a girl and a boy with the same GCSE results. Then the girl is actually predicted slightly more optimistically than the boy now. So this is like a suppression effect. The true differential only emerges upon statistical control. You adjust for A-level subject, and that's where it really widens a lot. And this is because boys lean a little bit more towards the sciences, where there's big optimism. Girls lean slightly more to the social sciences and arts, where there's lower optimism. So it's an unfair comparison. You adjust for academic subjects, so you compare a girl and a boy in the same subject. In geography, say, and then within that subject, we see girls being predicted more optimistically than boys. Okay. And why is this? That doesn't sound very fair. I'm a boy. I would be predicted optimistically. Well, one possible explanation for this, and as I said, this is all descriptive exploratory research. You know, I'm offering some potential explanations as we go through, but we're not really testing any of these hypotheses. I acknowledge that. That's future work will no doubt do that. But you know, one explanation for this is that there is a stereotype, at least, that the girls work a little bit more consistently through their studies, whereas boys less so, and then they can pick up a bit, particularly over Easter and cramming, quite often quite successfully. But the teachers, at the point of making predictions, you know, they still need to kind of be evidencing these to some extent. They've got to go what's in front of them. And the boys haven't shown much up to that point as a limit to how high they can predict them optimistically. So it's not necessarily that there's a bias in favor of girls here at the point of making the predictions. It could be at the point of making predictions, there's no differential whatsoever between girls and boys. It's more that post predictions, the boys, if you like, unexpectedly catch up, and that reduces the optimism, apparent optimism that was applied to them. Applied to them. If we now look at ethnicity, this shows a more standard pattern whereby initial differences between groups, with the black and the Asian being predicted more optimistically than the whites, dampen down upon statistical control, but still remain. Same with IMD, they dampen down. Now these get overly pinched together because there's a bit of over control here. Because I have those three measures of SES, and yeah. I've adjusted for polar here and parental occupational when we jump here, that jump from here to here. So that's excessive. And so that's a little bit, I acknowledge that's a little bit misleadingly pinched together. But there is a general trend of that kind of narrowing to some extent. Geography is kind of interesting because this is one of the places where we saw the biggest differentials. But it's also one of the variables where we have the least explanation. And you can see that we have these substantial variation here, which only dampens down a bit. There's a bit of reordering, but not that much. Although admittedly the bulk is here, but still even that bulk is pretty substantial, yeah, from 0.7 to 0.9, and it's, you know, maybe it's now 0.75. 0.75, and it's still, you know, still pretty substantial, the bulk of it. And I would have thought that adjusting for GCSE scores, which clearly varies across geography, and adjusting for SES and ethnicity would dampen this down much more, and it hasn't. So kind of place continues to matter here for optimism. The last graph I'll show you is this one here, which is school type, which shows a different patterning again, one of the reordering of the categories, and not necessarily much dampening down for other categories. So initially, state schools students are over-predicted 0.92 versus independent schools 0.72. But of course, the students are very different across those two school types. You adjust for GCSE scores to make a kind of cleaner comparison, perhaps, and the independent schools students shoot up because, of course, they have very high GCSE scores and very low headspace for optimism. You kind of try and adjust for that A-level scale ceiling effect, and that reveals that they're actually more optimistic. And that would initially suggest that, or if you like, the true degree of optimism that is being applied in independent schools is somewhat masked by those simple descriptive statistics. They do the best they can in terms of optimism within the limited scope they can be to be optimistic, if you like. And that continues to play out, particularly just for SES, and they end up going from the least optimistic group to the most optimistic group on statistical control. And that may well reflect the kind of the point of independent schools, which is to get great grades for the students and to get them, more importantly, to get them into the top universities and courses where the grade requirement, entry requirements are highest. And so there is a particular pressure on the independent schools to really predict optimistically, and they can in a way which isn't which doesn't look bad on them in terms of the raw results. So raw results perhaps. But interestingly, sixth form colleges, this just kind of stays being kind of less optimistic than the national average. So why would this be? One explanation is these are kind of school type which kicks in at age 16, and they're big, these schools. So there's less of a relationship between students and their teachers. The teachers don't know the students so well. The parents are less involved in sixth form colleges than perhaps conventional schools. There's less pressure being put on teachers, less vested interest in the teachers. Perhaps also because they're much bigger entities, and there might be two teachers teaching a given subject and two teachers making predictions, and there's more benchmarking and standardization in the process than in smaller cohorts. That might kind of keep a lid on a degree of optimism as well. Perhaps also a lower proportion of students in sixth form colleges are perhaps taking the UCAS route versus other school types, and so it's less the be all and end all to really kind of get to max the kids into Russell Group universities and so on. Okay. So just summing up now, so what I've shown you is a kind of exploratory descriptive analysis of optimism. I think we've shown that it's big on average. I think we've shown that it kind of varies substantially across student and school groups. We're given some explanations along the way, but only partially. I haven't explained county. And these are just potential explanations. They're not ones that I've tested in the analysis, I acknowledge that. But subsequent research, this will hopefully be useful for subsequent research. Now, to the extent to which you think that differential optimism is a little bit uncomfortable and should be tempered down, one could try and give advice to teachers. And so, for example, UCAS, they are giving advice to teachers. They're just not giving any numerics with that. And maybe a little bit of numeric support in terms of how much optimism they should be giving might help, keep things under control. But it's very hard to kind of say how, should they be being over-predicting half a grade on average or a quarter of a grade or whatever it is, particularly because of that A-level scale ceiling effect. You can't just give one number. Also, it's not really known at what point desirable strays into excessive optimism. I mean, research is required to establish that. Another route is data-driven predictions. One could imagine a situation where instead or together with the teacher prediction is a data prediction, which says, well, nationally, students with these characteristics in that GCSE profile went on to get these grades on average last year. But of course, that all sounds rather too much like the optical algorithm, which assigned actual grades to students during COVID. So I suspect no one wants to go near that idea. But also, whilst that can work great at the aggregate level, it's always going to be terrible at the individual level in terms of accuracy, and that is what matters here. Okay, the individual. So finally, most obviously, perhaps, is reform to the system in general. And of course, this is something which comes up all the time, which is there a better way of organising things? Is there a post-qualification admissions system? Most recently, DfE consulted on that in 2021. They did propose two potential models for how this could work, but both of them have their own problems, which were essentially related to it being a very compressed time frame over the summer that students will be applying. And given it's over the summer and less time, students won't have the support of their teachers in guiding them. They can't build relationships with their respective universities. This will particularly disadvantage poorer kids again, which is counterproductive. And there's obviously less time for interviews and so on as well. And so DFE ultimately kicked that down the road, I think, claiming that there's more important to focus on recovering from the pandemic. And we'll come back to it later. But hopefully, when they do come back to it, they'll be able to make use of analysis such as this one, which have now become possible since that consultation with the release of the grade data. And that's it. So thank you very much. The work is published that I've just shown you in higher education. It's published with Konstantina, who's at Cambridge. And actually, Konstantina is now leading a bit of work focusing specifically on the gender gap in optimism and looking at a subject basis, but also actually testing some of these competing explanations for why we see the patterns we see formally, as opposed to just kind of offering them as potential explanations. Okay.